Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. Today we're going to continue our lecture series on social change in Appalachia by talking about the history of coal extraction in central Appalachia. Now, in the previous lecture, we learned that coal was a very important part of the American Industrial Revolution, and the environmental conditions in Appalachia made it perfect for creating a very desirable coal called bituminous coal. In this situation, we now want to understand the extraction process itself, and this involved what we call coal camps or coal towns. These were where the entire coal extraction process happened, but also the people who worked there lived and played out their lives. Today, we're going to talk about what you might find in a coal camp, but we're also going to talk along the way about how this was organized to make sure that coal extraction continued to happen predictably and on schedule. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Please share it with your friends as well. We got a lot to do today, so what do you say we get started? So I always like to joke with my students that coal mines pick the absolute worst possible places to be. They couldn't be in like downtown Pittsburgh. No, they're in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains in rural West Virginia, miles and miles and miles from anything else. But that was the situation in which we found ourselves. If we were going to extract the coal of Appalachia for this American Industrial Revolution, we had to overcome those conditions. Now, railroads made a lot of that possible. If we can send a railroad into an area, we could load the coal into it and take the coal anywhere we wanted to. In fact, that really dealt with the issue that you couldn't send coal out by the rivers effectively. So now we can get the coal out. But how do we make it possible to extract it? Well, coal companies realized there was a couple of things that would have to happen. They basically would have to be self-sufficient, standalone camps or even towns over time. They could do a couple of things, that they could keep the workers alive, that they had the food and clothes that they needed, that the supplies that were necessary for families could be there, that they had working conditions available. They made sure that they had the gear, the safety scenarios, the technology, the masons, and so forth to make sure coal mining was happening. And also to be able to control it, because they really couldn't depend on, say, like the downtown police to help. They were in the middle of nowhere. As such, they would need to hire their own police, private security forces. And they'd also need to have certain norms and expectations and understandings so that coal miners knew that basically, couldn't get away with a lot of stuff. And more importantly, too, throughout all of this, there was no myth to anyone that coal mining was going to be the central purpose of this. In fact, even looking back in old historical documents like Coal Age, we saw coal mining company executives talking about they designed these towns for very specific purposes, to make sure coal mining happens predictably, to minimize issues, to maximize profits, and to just make sure this whole system keeps running no matter what. In some way, in fact, that ended up being a fourth tenet of what they were expected to do here, was to create a town that ensured that mining continued to happen no matter what. So as we're building a coal camp, I want to go through a list of common things that we will find in them. Note that not all coal camps have all of these. The smaller camps will have far less, whereas coal communities and towns that are much larger and have maybe even multiple mines will actually have a lot more supplies. They may have things like schools and theaters, whereas a small camp is going to be lucky if they have a pack of cards. But nonetheless, these are all parts of understanding how a coal camp operates. Throughout, you'll also start to see some very specific cases where there's a power dynamic at hand, where basically the miners are at a disadvantage because of their situation as a miner, as opposed to being, say, the mine operator who has more resources, more opportunities, and a lot more say-so and control in the situation. Now, first off, all your coal camps are going to be built around a mine shaft, often called the mouth of the shaft. This is where you basically enter the mine, you go underground to extract coal. The shaft was an important part because this was your access point for getting the resources in and getting the resources out. And these were often very low-level things where, you basically would hop on a rectangular device that would just sort of roll you through. They weren't necessarily huge that you could just walk in. You basically would lay down and ride in. In other situations, there might be a trolley system or like an elevator system that would take you further down. It really depended on the location of the mine and so forth. But this was the centerpiece of everything. It was kind of like the center of the town. And it was symbolic because work was the centerpiece of the town. One important important thing to remember, too, is coal camps can actually serve more than one shaft. Coal shafts can go lots of different directions, and in fact, one shaft might be exhausted, so it would be retired, and then you would start another one. So we can't think of like these shafts as like, offering just endless amounts of coal. They would be exhausted at some point. Often you would have something called a tipple. Now, the tipple is the process of where you load the coal into a train so that it can be shipped elsewhere. Tipples can offer a couple of different things. There can be some sorting mechanisms to some degree. Probably wasn't going to be common with Central Appalachia because bituminous coal, you didn't need to sort so much like anthracite. Anthracite, in fact, could be sent to a resizing plant or a coal crushing camp where they basically would break it down to the right useful sizes of anthracite. But basically with this soft bituminous coal, you just got it cleaned up and you sent it out. In fact, for the tipple, that was an opportunity for you to wash the coal to separate things that weren't coal from that mix and get that into the train. The train would come into what's called a depot. Now, the depot would serve a couple of things. There would be areas for loading and unloading by the tipple for getting supplies and so forth. But the depot could also basically be a train station. This is where when people were dropped off into this community, they would be left there at the train station. Train station could be as simple as like there's a ladder and a stool beside the side of where the train will stop, and like that's going to be where you step out. Or it can be something really big. In fact, you can look up pictures of Thurmond, West Virginia's train station, which has now been rehabilitated and looks amazing if you're ever in that area and get a chance to visit it. But the depot is where we receive passengers and where we receive supplies. It's interesting, too, because getting to those depots was largely dependent on being able to access them via the railroads. The railroads were the only way in and out of camp. Remember in our previous lecture how we mentioned people were being brought in and maybe not fully understanding what jobs that they were basically accepting by getting on that train. Well, if you don't like the job and you want to leave, you've got to get on that train to get out of there. You're in a situation that you're dependent on that train to leave. You can't have your buddy pick you up or help you move out of your apartment. I mean, you've got to be able to hop on that train and get in and get out. And that in and of itself can be really, really difficult. In fact, one of the things that we slowly but surely start to see in these coal camps is a situation where people are kind of compelled to stay there because they can't really leave. The classic example of this would be what's called the company store. Now, fair enough. You're in the middle of nowhere, West Virginia. There's not going to be like a Walmart around every corner or a 7-Eleven or a Wawa's or any of those things, right? You're stuck in a situation that you're going to have to be dependent on who will sell supplies to you. And in this case, the mine owners would actually create stores, often giving the rights to other people so that they could make money off of a concession. But basically, they would be able to sell goods to the miners. And they would. Everything that you could possibly need would often be available in one of the company stores. There was some problems with this, however. Basically, you worked on credit because you couldn't just spend cash at most company stores, or if you did, it was at a differential price. In fact, what ends up happening is often because there were no banks in the area, or it was hard to have a series of banks in the area, except in the largest coal towns, you would basically be paid in scrip, which meant that the coal company kept up with how much credit you had and that you would be able to spend this in one place and one place only. You'd be able to go to the company store. It was a weird economy built on the idea of fake money. It also created a situation, too, where people would often, because they weren't used to having the ability to buy so many goods, would buy themselves deep into debt. Now, first off, when you get there, you were debted for the supplies that you were going to need to extract coal. So you didn't get a free helmet. They would actually dock your pay for it, and you would owe that back to the company store. And if that broke and you had to get a new carbide lamp, you would buy that also from the company store. Same thing goes for your picks, getting those sharpened, getting those serviced. These were all services, but you typically would have to pay for them. And on top of that, too, you get into a situation that now you have all this money and there's really nothing else to do. So people would start buying a lot of stuff and they would become indebted to the company store. In fact, they would buy so much stuff that they would owe more, knowing that they were going to be continuing to work there. They would owe more than they actually had in terms of income. Nonetheless, the scrip system puts you in a situation that it could be very hard to leave. And I don't have exact historical cases to cite here, but I've always wondered about the idea. If you work yourself into debt, Would you be allowed to leave on the railroads, or would you be compelled to stay until you had cleared that debt? Because you're so far into these remote Appalachian wilderness, banks weren't a thing that were just around the corner. And to be honest, banks weren't as common as they are today. Now, the banks really weren't necessarily for the miners. They were using the scrip system, which had nothing to do with the banks. But the very real profits that were happening from selling the coal actually did require banks. And so these larger towns, and Thurmond would be another great example of this in West Virginia, needed to have at least one bank as part of that process. Likewise, two banks would be in part of any deals that were made, any purchases, buying gear, selling gear, and so forth. But they were always separate from that company store scrip system because they actually used real money in banks. But this service wasn't for the miners. Now, the services that often were with the miners were including things like saloons and theaters. This also included sort of roaming theaters that might be a performance that would call from one camp and then to another camp and then to a third one. It could just be local musicians who were also miners playing music, but entertainment was provided. The big thing here is that entertainment was a necessity. We can't take all these people, often single males at the time and young, out into the middle of nowhere and them have really nothing to do with their free time. Because if they do that, they're probably going to get in fights. There's going to be drinking. There's going to be bad stuff happen. They need something to help blow off steam. And the mine owners realized that. So saloons would be added where you could get a stiff drink, probably at an increased price, probably using the scrip system. But nonetheless, you'd be able to drink. And if we let people blow off steam, they were also less likely to do things like strikes or stop working or complain about their work experiences. They would blow off their steam and their anger and they would get back to work. Kind of falls into that whole critical lens thinking about the labor market, right? Coke ovens were also a common thing for West Virginia. Now, West Virginia, the coal would come out and it could be put into a coke oven and cooked. And you would make something called coke, which was a more purified coal that basically had all the slag, the things like iron or any other deposits. The sulfur also would probably be burned off. That could be used in furnaces and all sorts of other things. So it was basically an upscale of the product, but it made it more desirable. In some of the larger camps that were more like communities and towns, you would actually see things like chapels and schools. There are some conversations. John Gaventa's work would be a great example of that, where we talk about what exactly was being taught there. And also that relates to chapels. Churches and schools are social institutions. They're examples of reinstituting the norms to tell us how we should behave in a particular situation. And there's some arguments that these were locations that could also be used to kind of control the local community. On top of that, too, the churches could be sort of a form of political power. They could basically discourage things like, don't be someone who would be a person who would strike and stop the mine. You need to work hard, because that would be a very sort of Protestant ethic kind of way to approach things, right? Your job here is to work hard and you're going to receive your reward in your afterlife. In both situations, we can understand how these social institutions, however, may have framed people's behaviors. Hotels were part of this. Again, not generally for the miners. These were for executives, but coal mining executives would come through from time to time. And there were cases, too, where miners might get hotels and go crazy for the night. Finally, the post office was an important part of coal camps. Now, post office is a way basically to say that you are officially a town. And in West Virginia's New River Gorge, you would find these little small post offices that were like one-room shacks. Standing room only situation, but where people were now a town because they had a zip code and they had a post office. It was sort of a form of legitimacy. But it also was a place, again, that we control the flow of information. Information could only come in through the railroads and through the post office. And so if we could control those situations, we made sure that we could keep information that maybe we didn't want in from coming into the area. So imagine for a moment that you live in these conditions, that you're a miner in a situation where you're told you can only spend money that isn't real at a specific store at, increased prices. And, you were working a 6-day week and maybe even a 7-day week in some situations, and you're making all this money, but none of it's real. You can't really do anything with it. Imagine this scenario. Imagine what that would feel like. Imagine that power dynamic too that we're slowly starting to see between the miners and the mine operators. This is the background for the West Virginia Mine Wars, a historical event that will guide us through four standalone events to understand how we go from a simple strike at a camp with the Paint and Cabin Creek coal camps to the largest armed insurrection in U.S. history since the Civil War at Blair Mountain. This pathway is going to walk us continually through this process of understanding how Appalachia has been used to extract resources for the benefit of the nation. But we can often see in many cases the people of Appalachia have paid the price for that. So we got a lot of things to cover. That's the end of this lecture. In our next lecture series, we're going to begin our conversations about the West Virginia Mine Wars. As always, thanks for watching this channel. If you will go ahead and subscribe, like this video, leave comments below. I love chatting with you. And I'll see you next time. Take care.